Hello and welcome back to ThoughtBat. Today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different, as this is my first video using a script, which means I finally have to put some effort into making a video. Who'd have thought being a YouTuber would have actually took time and effort? In this video, I'm going to be talking about the concept of property, what it is, how it may be justified, and which types of property are validated by my justification. By property, I am referring to an object or area of land by which the owner reserves the right to alienate from other people. I feel that, within modern anarchist circles, the concept of property, its justifications and its implications for our politics, isn't explored as much as its fundamental role in anarchist and socialist politics demands. Most anarchists know that the property rights which give rise to the plutocratic oligarchy that we live in today, known as capitalism, is incompatible with the concept of a free society, and so they rightly reject it. But what is our issue with such oligarchy? Utilitarian anarchists will explain that the centralization of economic power leads to the worsening of life quality for a greater number of people than it improves, which I feel is true in many cases yet untrue in many others. It is certainly possible for the powerful to decide to improve the quality of life for their subjects, and this possibility makes room for reformism. Negative consequences can be alleviated or softened through reform, and, in this instance, these reforms come in the shape of wealth redistribution, nationalisation of certain industries, and other policies which force or incentivise the powerful to allow their subjects to live happier lives without necessarily abolishing the source of the issue. And so the reformists are satisfied as long as improvements to the general population standards of living continue to be observed and documented. This means that the problem cannot be resolved using consequentialist analysis alone. We haven't yet explained why the property of the capitalist class is illegitimate on principle in order to make a case for its abolition. So we must ask, what is property? And more importantly, why is property? This inquiry was made by Pierre-Joseph Proudhon in his 1840 publication conveniently titled What is Property?, in which he famously exclaims, "Property is robbery." By the way, you can read the book for free on the Anarchist Library, and I will post a link in the description below. It should be noted that, by property, Proudhon was specifically referring to the land titles and sovereign rights of property which allowed the proprietor to do with his property as he pleases, which is, to use and abuse at the owner's whim. While investigating the claims made about the origins of property and its position in French law as yet another natural right of man, Proudhon argued that this sovereign right to property contrasted the other so-called natural rights, i.e. liberty, equality and security, as seen in the Declaration of Rights in 1793. I feel that this point is still relevant today, as property being one of the so-called natural rights is the most common ethical defence of property rights made by contemporary liberals and conservatives. In his critique, Proudhon highlighted the main difference between the right of property and the other natural rights, which is that, for those who are not landowners, property, quote, only exists potentially and as a dormant faculty without exercise. For those who do enjoy it, it is susceptible of certain transactions and modifications which are not in harmony with the idea of a natural right, end quote. Here, Proudhon is actually turning the liberal philosophy of the bourgeoisie back on itself, as the right to property does not even meet the standards for what classical liberals would call a natural right. I would add that the sovereign right to property is not only dissimilar, but antithetical to the rights of liberty, equality and security. Antithetical to liberty, as the users of property must necessarily be submissive to the owner's whim. Antithetical to equality, as the proprietors have far more power and liberties than the non-proprietors. And antithetical to security, as the user does not have to be given any guarantees about their access to the property. Bosses and landlords who have absolute sovereignty over their property may cast out the employee or renter for whatever reason they see fit. Any claim that the property is the individual source of liberty and security is to suggest that those who do not own property are neither free nor secure. There exist other attempts to justify property aside from those given by the natural law theorists. Libertarians on the right of the political compass may often defend property rights by that people have the right to the product of their own labour. This seemingly meritocratic justification fails to hold up on two levels. Firstly, because property must precede labour. In order to freely mix one's labour with an object, one must already own the objects they are manipulating in order to lay claim to the product. I cannot glue your household items together, call it a piece of art and then claim it is mine because, in manipulating your belongings without your consent, I have violated your sovereign right to property. So the conversation inevitably becomes one about first appropriation, or Bagsy economics, which itself is shaky ground, as it is impossible to determine exactly which of our ancestors used the property or land before any other. In England, for example, the bourgeoisie were effectively gifted their property by the Enclosure Act of 1771, a bill which is still in force today, which stripped commoners of the right to access and use land across the country in favour of wealthy landowners. As George Orwell put it in 1944, stop to consider how the so-called owners of the land got hold of it. They simply seized it by force, afterwards hiring lawyers to provide them with title deeds. In the case of the enclosure of the common lands, which was going on from about 1600 to 1850, the land grabbers did not even have the excuse of being foreign conquerors. They were quite frankly taking the heritage of their own countrymen, upon no sort of pretext except that they had the power to do so. Indeed, the history of property and its lack of adherence to any consistent ethical principle makes any ethical claim based on historical or the original proprietorship inconsistent. So we are still without a solid justification for property in our investigation. Does this mean that there is absolutely no case for any form of property rights whatsoever? I don't believe so. Indeed, Proudhon was critiquing a specific type of land ownership. He made distinctions between property and possession, which he believed was valid. If we accept the definition of property to be an object which the owner may alienate from others, then we can quickly find scenarios where doing such a thing is helpful and necessary. For example, it would be unjust if someone were to walk into my house and help themselves to the contents of my fridge, try on my favourite clothes, or make themselves at home in my living room. Each person greatly benefits from having a private, personal space where they can live peacefully and store their belongings, on both a mental and a physical level. After all, one must manipulate or consume objects around them in order to continue living. Even the most radical communist can admit that there is justification for exclusive access to these things. And this exclusive access to objects is called property, so we must see what property may be justified. Max Stirner, the German egoist philosopher who was active around the same time as Proudhon, responded and added to Proudhon's assessment. He emphasized that the use of the word robbery implies that there must already exist a legitimate proprietor to be robbed from, rendering the blanket statement that property is robbery an oxymoron. In his book titled The Ego and Its Own, Stirner rips the concept of property away from its legal usage and defines it materialistically as that which an individual knows how to take and defend. Whilst this offers no prescriptions about how property rights may function within a free society, if at all, Stirner gives us an important reminder that property is not a product of consistent application of ethics, but of the assertion of authority. As Proudhon showed us, the revolutionary government in France clearly did not advocate the sovereign right to property as a result of ethical consistency. It was perhaps added to the list of natural rights for the convenience of its bourgeois authors. For Stirner, property and the social hierarchies which are built around it are merely intersubjective concepts which have no presence in material reality, meaning that there is nothing essential about their existence. Instead, they only exist and play such a large role in our daily lives because the majority of people allow them to do so intellectually. The question that Stirner therefore prompts us to ask is whether believing in and respecting what Proudhon calls the sovereign right to property is really in their own self-interest. Understanding that property is not a concrete fact of the universe makes it a malleable aspect of politics which is literally left to the imagination of those seeking change. As Stirner says, the labourers had the most enormous power in their hands, and, if they once became thoroughly conscious of it and used it, nothing would withstand them. They would only have to stop labour, regard the product of labour as theirs, and enjoy it. This is the sense of the labour disturbances which show themselves here and there. The state rests on the slavery of labour. If labour becomes free, the state is lost. Here, through acknowledging the essential role of labour in production, Stirner is admitting that the only thing standing in the way of labourers' emancipation is not some metaphysical restraint on human potential, but the mere belief in the legitimacy of the proprietor's claims to power over them. In other words, the path to freedom is paved by class consciousness. Stirner's egoist take on property is very much in tune with that of the anarcho-syndicalists. Members of the working class should only tolerate the property rights which serve working class interests. As an alternative to the sovereign right to property, Proudhon argued in favour of the concept of proprietorship which is more compatible with the other three natural rights. This was to be called usufruct, as it was based on use and occupancy alone as opposed to the absentee property which is seemingly based on bourgeois whim. For Proudhon, usufruct possession rights were compatible with the other natural rights as it allowed for the freedom to manipulate, produce, exchange and consume resources without hindrance, allowing for more personal liberty. Its mutual respect amongst people would mean equality, as each person necessarily occupies limited space and consumes a limited amount of resources in order to live. Finally, it promotes security, as it provides an intellectual defence of a person's private space to be used as a source of privacy and comfort. The utility to the individual and its mutuality offered by usufruct property norms meets criteria for legitimacy set by both Proudhon and Stirner, as well as that of anarchism. This utility may be enjoyed by all individuals without erecting economic and political hierarchies, which are not economically or politically necessary. There would no longer be an owning class holding supreme authority over a class of non-owners, and thus there is no need for a state to regulate these class relations. The owner and the labourer become one of the same. I will talk about the intricacies of how useful property norms may be implemented, what ideological criticisms there may be of it, and how those criticisms may be addressed in another video. But for now, I hope you found this video insightful. If you did, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. I'm still in my early stages, so maybe we can get the show on the road. Thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you next time. Goodbye.